darkness here wasn't merely the absence of light. It was a living, pressing entity that swallowed the 4,600-ton steel hull of the USS Borealis, SSN 581, whole as she crept through the silent, gelid void 400 feet below the Barents Sea. The year was 1968, but calendars were a surface world conceit. Down here, time was measured in the metronomic ping, ping, ping of the active sonar, the sour tang of recycled air, and the slow, silent accumulation of fear. Captain Elias Crow stood in the red-tinged gloom of the control room, a statue of fatigue and tension. His eyes, two chips of gray flint in a face carved by decades of command and caffeine, scanned the dimly lit panels. The air was a thick soup of smells. Hydraulic fluid, ozone from humming electronics, stale coffee, and the cloying scent of sweat from 39 men who had been entombed together for 42 days. It was the perfume of the Cold War, bottled in a steel tube. The Borealis, a skipjack-class attack submarine, was a hunter-killer. Her mission, filed under oceanographic research, was simple in objective, hellish in execution. Find a Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine, a boomer, and stick to her like a ghost. A boomer carried 16 SSN-6 missiles, each with a 2-megaton warhead. Enough firepower to erase the eastern seaboard from the map. And Crow's job was to be the unseen finger on its neck, to track it, to log its acoustic signature, to ensure that if the unthinkable order ever came from Washington, the kill would be clean, quick, and first. It was a job that twisted the soul. You spent months listening to the ocean's empty choir, the creak of your own hull under pressure, the distant song of a whale, only for the silence to be shattered by the mechanical heartbeat of the thing you were sent to kill. You learned its sounds intimately, the specific whine of its pump jet, the shudder of its turbines, the faint, almost imperceptible hum of its reactor. It became an obsession, a phantom you had to chase but never see. Captain, a voice, hushed but sharp, cut through the low murmur of the control room. It was Lieutenant James Kohler, the sonar officer. Young, brilliant, with nerves of titanium wire, but even his voice carried a new, brittle edge. Bearing 270, passive contact, designate Sierra 1. Crow moved to the sonar station, a cramped alcove of green scope screens and tangled wires. The rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum was faint, almost buried in the ambient noise. But it was there, the heartbeat. Soviet, Yankee class, their white whale. Classification? Crow asked, his voice a low gravel. Confirmed Yankee, sir, Kohler whispered, his eyes glued to the waterfall display. Solution places her at 12,000 yards, heading east-southeast, making 18 knots, standard patrol speed. A routine contact. This was the game. Find the boomer, trail it at a discreet distance, report its position, and wait. A cat-and-mouse game played in absolute darkness where the mouse could level cities. Crow felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The weight of the lives aboard his boat. The weight of the cities his target could destroy. The crushing, claustrophobic weight of knowing one wrong move, one sound out of place, could trigger a cascade that ended everything. He gave the orders, his voice steady, betraying none of the acid churning in his gut. Helm, all ahead 1/3. Make your depth 450 feet. Sonar, I want a full passive solution, not a ping. We are a ghost. Communications, prepare a routine sitrep for command. No mention of Sierra 1's exact coordinates. The Soviets might be listening. The Borealis, a silent predator, began to turn. The deck tilted slightly underfoot. A faint, metallic groan echoed through the pressure hull, the sound of the ocean trying to crush them. A constant reminder of their fragile existence. Somewhere in the crew's mess, a loose pipe dripped. Plink, plink, plink. It had been dripping for a week. No one could find a source. It was the soundtrack to their insanity. Crow watched the blip on the tactical plot, a small green dot representing a vessel of apocalyptic potential. For now, it was routine. Just another day in the silent war. But as he stared into the green glow, a cold, unreasoning dread began to crystallize in his gut. Something was off. The contact's course was too straight, too predictable. It wasn't weaving, wasn't performing the standard crazy Ivan. A sudden 180-degree turn to check its baffles for a tail. It was sailing as if it owned the sea, or as if it didn't care who was following. In the oppressive silence, broken only by the thrum of the enemy and the plink of the maddening drip, Crow knew with a veteran's certainty. This was not a routine patrol. This was the beginning of something else. And in the crushing blackness of the deep, the hunter was about to realize he might be the one being hunted. The Borealis became an extension of Crow's will, a phantom made of silent steel. For 6 hours, they shadowed Sierra 1, a wolf pacing a grazing mammoth from the deep shadows. The control room was a cathedral of tense silence. Men spoke in whispers, if at all. The only constant sounds were the hypnotic ping of their own, sparingly used active sonar, the low hum of machinery, and that infernal, omnipresent drip from the mess deck. It had become a metronome for their fraying nerves. Crow never left the control room. He sipped cold, bitter coffee, his eyes rarely leaving the tactical plot or Cola's strained face at the sonar station. The young officer's initial professionalism was hardening into something else. A deep, focused intensity, tinged with the first flickers of unease. "Sir," Cola's voice was a dry leaf rustle. He didn't look up from his screen. "Sierra 1. She's changing her profile." Crow was at his side in 3 strides. "Explain." "The harmonic signature. It's fluctuating. Not like a mechanical fault. It's deliberate. She's cycling through different pump speeds, varying reactor output, minimal changes, but systematic." Cola finally glanced up, his eyes reflecting the green glow of the scope. "It's like she's trying to paint a different acoustic picture. Or she knows she's being listened to and is testing the water." A cold trickle of sweat traced Crow's spine. A Soviet boomer on a strategic patrol was a creature of habit, a monument to predictable, efficient propulsion. What Cola was describing was the behavior of an attack boat, a hunter like their own. It was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Could it be a new class? Something we haven't catalogued? Crow asked, though he knew the answer. Cola shook his head, a tight, minuscule movement. "The base signature is pure Yankee, sir. This is layered on top. It's a skill, a very, very quiet skill." The implication hung in the ozone-heavy air. They were tailing a Soviet ballistic missile submarine that was acting like it was aware of them. Not just aware, but communicating. This wasn't a lumbering behemoth. It was a beast that had turned its head and was sniffing the dark. "Helm, all stop," Crow ordered, his voice betraying nothing. The faint vibration of the turbines ceased, leaving a void filled only by the creak of the hull and the pounding of hearts. The Borealis drifted, a dead thing in the water, her listening ears wide open. In the sudden absolute silence, the sound from the sonar speaker became crystalline. Thrum, 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 thrum. A pattern, not random. A short pulse, a double tap, a long pulse. It repeated. He's pinging, the helmsman breathed, his knuckles white on the wheel. No, Kohler corrected, his face pale. That's not active sonar. That's him, his propulsion. He's modulating his own noise, on purpose. Kohler looked at Crow, a shadow of real fear in his eyes. Sir, he's signaling, and he's signaling us. The control room froze. Every man understood this was beyond doctrine, beyond the silent rules of their shadow war. This was contact, deliberate, unnerving, intimate contact. Crow's mind raced. Options, each worse than the last. Break off and run, reveal their presence and position definitively. Stay silent. Admit they heard and understood nothing. A dangerous game of chicken. Respond in kind. An unthinkable escalation. What did the signal mean? A warning? A challenge? An invitation to a dance that could only end in mutual destruction? Record the pattern, Crow said, his jaw tight. Every nuance. Chief of the boat, I want a full systems check. I want to know if he's got torpedo tube door cycling, if his fire control is painting us with anything. Assume nothing. The next minutes were an eternity. The Soviet boat continued its bizarre, rhythmic thrumming. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The original, steady patrol speed signature resumed. But now, it felt different. It felt like a mask had been put back on. The silence that followed was 1,000 times heavier. Then, from the forward torpedo room, a frantic call crackled over the ship-wide intercom. Control, torpedo room. Flooding alarm. Minor input side forward compensation tank. Indicates possible external valve failure or impact. The words hit Crow like a physical blow. Impact. There had been no impact. They hadn't felt a thing. But in the silent, pressurized world of the deep, a gentle nudge from a 1,000-ton object could be imperceptible. A collision. The ultimate taboo. Had the Yankee, in the dark, somehow closed the distance? Had it just touched them? A Soviet nuclear submarine, carrying enough warheads to start Armageddon, had just brushed against his hull in a silent, deep-sea kiss of death. The dripping pipe in the mess deck seemed to laugh. Plink. 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 Crow looked around the control room, seeing the fear he felt mirrored in the faces of his men. Good men, trapped in a steel coffin with a ghost that had just reached out and tapped them on the shoulder. The routine mission was over. They were no longer hunters. They were prey in a game where the rules had just been rewritten in the dark. The air in the control room turned to glass. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was the faint, panicked hiss of the intercom and that godforsaken mocking drip from the mess deck. It was as if the universe had paused, holding its breath before the plunge. Captain Crow shattered the stillness. His voice, when it came, was a whip crack of controlled fury that masked the cold terror clawing at his ribs. Torpedo room, report. Confirm the nature of the leak. Is it seawater? Rate of ingress. The reply was strained, a young torpedo man's voice fighting for composure. Control, it's seawater, sir. Valve Beta 7 on the external hull. It's sheared. Not a drill failure. The housing is bent inward. Rate is slow. We're on it with the pumps. But It looks like a strike, Captain. A glance and blow. A glance and blow. From a 10,000-ton submarine they hadn't even heard approach. It was impossible. It was a ghost story made steel and salt water. All stop. Rig for silent running. Absolute silence, Crow ordered, his mind a frozen lake over a churning abyss of calculations. The Borealis had to vanish, become a hole in the ocean. Every non-essential system whined down. The ventilation dropped to a whisper. The red battle lamps cast long, monstrous shadows that danced with every man's nervous tremor. The smell of fear became sharp, coppery. The smell of adrenaline sweat breaking through the usual stench of oil and ozone. Crow's eyes locked with Kohler's at the sonar station. Where is he, James? Kohler's fingers danced across his console, pale in the gloom. His face was a mask of concentration, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. The waterfall display was a chaotic mess of their own hull noises and the fading reverberations of the incident. Then he saw it, a shadow within the noise. He's turning, sir. Hard to port. He's coming around. He's putting us in his baffles. Kohler's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. He's maneuvering, aggressively. Range, uncertain. He's using the thermal layer to mask his turn. He knows we're here. He knows exactly where we are. The Yankee wasn't running. It was circling, a predator assessing a wounded rival. The implications were world-ending. A Soviet ballistic missile submarine, a vessel whose sole purpose was to hide and survive to guarantee a second strike, was now actively, audaciously hunting an American attack sub. This was a breakdown of all doctrine, all the unspoken rules that kept the Cold War cold under the sea. Either the Yankees' captain had gone rogue, insane with the pressure of his own apocalyptic cargo, or this was something else. A trap, a provocation. Con, sonar, new contact. Another sonar man called out, his voice cracking. Baron 090, different harmonic signature. Smaller, higher frequency. It's an Alpha, sir. Soviet attack boat. A second contact. Ice flooded Crow's veins. It was a trap. The Yankee was the bait, the lumbering bear. The Alpha class, a small titanium-hulled demon, faster and deeper diving than anything in the American arsenal, was the hunter-killer. They had been drawn into a pincer. Battle stations. Quietly, Crow said, the words tasting of ash. The soft, mournful clang of the general alarm was muted, a ghost of its usual self, but it sent a visible shudder through the crew. Men moved with a new, desperate economy. This was it. The thing they trained for, the nightmare they whispered about in their bunks. The chief of the boat, a granite-faced veteran named McAllister, appeared at Crow's shoulder. Forward tank is secured, Captain. Pumps are holding. We've got a minor list, but she's sound. He paused, his eyes hard. The boys down there, they're spooked. They felt the hull grind. Said it sounded like a giant key turning in a lock. Crow nodded, his mind racing through tactical options, each one a dead end. Engage the Alpha, reveal their position with active sonar and torpedo doors, make themselves a bright target for the Yankees' likely escort. Run. The Alpha could outrun them, dive deeper. They were already near crush depth, and the Alpha's titanium hull could go deeper still. Hide? They were already compromised, bleeding a faint trail of noise and maybe even a chemical signature from the ruptured tank. Helm, all ahead 1/3. Make your depth 600 feet. Steer course 315. We're going to slide under the layer and try to put the mud between us and the Alpha. It was a desperate move, heading for the seafloor, turning the ocean itself into a blind alley. The Borealis tilted downward, groaning in protest. The pressure on the hull increased, a symphony of pops and creaks that sounded like the boat was being eaten alive. The dripping pipe in the mess now had a frantic, irregular rhythm. Plink, 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 plink. In the torpedo room, Seaman Riley, just 19, was pressed against the cold, curved hull next to the patched valve. In the red light, he could see a hairline crack spidering out from the repair. A bead of cold salt water formed, swelled, and traced a path down the green paint. He watched it, hypnotized by the slow, inevitable leak. It was the ocean, patient and infinite, reminding them it was just outside, waiting to crush them. He thought of his girl in San Diego, the sun on her hair. The contrast was so violent, he felt a sob claw at his throat. He bit down on his knuckle, the taste of salt and iron filling his mouth. Back in control, Kola was whispering a stream of data. Alpha is accelerating. Bearing is constant. He's on an intercept, Captain. He has our scent. The Yankee is holding position to the north. She stopped, just listening. Crow stared at the plot, the two red dots converging on his green one. His hand hovered near the button that would unlock the red-painted cover over the torpedo firing controls. To fire was to start a war. To not fire was to die. Webbs, stand by tubes 1 and 2, set for acoustic homing, shallow running, target the Alpha. The weapons officer, a man named Vargas, repeated the order, his voice hollow. The click of the safety covers being removed was the loudest sound in the room. Captain, Kola's voice was suddenly strange, detached. The Yankee, she's pinging. Active sonar, full power. A loud alien ping G screamed through the hull, a sound of pure, aggressive interrogation. It was the Yankee, lighting up the dark like a flare, painting the Borealis for the Alpha. It was a betrayal of the silent code. It was an act of war. The sound was physically painful. Men flinched. On the plot, the Alpha's symbol jumped forward, its course correction instantaneous. It had the data now. It was lining up its shot. Maximum emergency power, all ahead flank, helm, hard to starboard, launch countermeasures now. Crow barked. The Borealis shuddered as her turbines screamed to life, throwing men off balance. A cloud of noisy, bubble-generating decoys was ejected from the stern, a desperate attempt to create an acoustic smokescreen. For a few agonizing seconds, chaos reigned. The Alpha's signature blurred on the screen, confused by the countermeasures. But it was fast, too fast. It adjusted. Con, sonar, high-speed screw noises, bearing 095. It's a torpedo in the water. 2 of them. The words hung in the thick air. Time dilated. Crow saw it all in horrific slow motion. Vargas's hand hovering over the firing button, his eyes seeking confirmation. The helmsman's white-knuckled grip. Kola's head bowed over his scope as if in prayer. McAllister closing his eyes for a brief second. And in his own mind, a flash of his wife's face, not as she was now, but as she'd been the day he left, smiling bravely, not knowing she was kissing a ghost. He made the choice, not as a captain, but as a man holding a lit match next to the world's powder keg. Hold fire, Crow said, the words tearing from his throat. Do not engage. Dive. Take us into the canyon now. It was a suicidal gamble. The underwater canyon walls would scatter their own sonar, blind them completely, but might also confuse the incoming torpedo's acoustic seekers. It was running into a cave to escape a wolf. The Borealis heeled over, diving at a sickening angle towards the jagged contours of the seafloor. The hull shrieked in protest. Alarms blared. Depth warning, proximity warning. They were flying blind into a stone cathedral. In the torpedo room, the hairline crack by Seaman Riley's head split open with a sharp crack. A jet of icy high-pressure seawater sliced into the compartment like a blade. The scream of the damage control alarm was lost in the roar of the intrushing sea. The game was over. The ocean was coming in. And somewhere in the darkness above, 2 Soviet torpedoes were hunting the sound of their dying. The world became sound and pressure and terror. In the torpedo room, the scream of the seawater was a living beast. It wasn't a flood. It was a surgical strike from the deep, a needle jet of ocean driven by hundreds of pounds per square inch. It hit a secondary hydraulic line with the force of a bullet. The line burst, spraying flammable fluid across the compartment in a fine, greasy mist. The red battle lamps flickered in the haze. Seaman Riley didn't scream. The initial shock of the freezing water stole his breath, replaced by a primal electric panic. He was thrown back against a torpedo skid, the cold metal biting through his shirt. He saw the senior torpedo man, Chief Rollins, a man built like a fire plug, wading into the spray, his face a grimace of pure determination. "Forward damage control party, get in here, clamp that line, forget the hull crack, stem the hydraulic leak, now." The order was insane. The ocean was pouring in, and he was worried about fluid. But Riley understood. One spark in that atomized mist, and the explosion wouldn't just flood the room. It would incinerate it, flash cooking every man inside and likely rupturing the forward hull. They were choosing between drowning and burning. In the control room, the dive was a controlled crash. Captain Crow clung to the periscope column, his knuckles bloodless. The deafening ping of the Yankees' sonar had stopped, replaced by the more terrifying sound of their own hull grinding against the unseen edges of the submarine canyon. It was the sound of teeth on bone. 200 feet to canyon floor, the dive officer yelled, his voice pitched high. "Port side clear, starboard side, proximity warning. Hard to port, 10 degrees down bubble, blow negative to starboard." Crow roared over the cacophony. The Borealis responded sluggishly, her wounded bow dragging. The list increased. Coffee mugs slid off consoles, shattering on the deck. The dripping pipe in the mess was now a steady, pathetic stream. Kohler was shouting from sonar, his voice raw. "Torpedoes are active. They've acquired. They're pinging us. One is circling above the canyon rim. It's confused. The other is following us down. It's in the canyon." A Soviet UGST torpedo. Acoustic seeker. Smart. It was now chasing them through a stone labyrinth, its pings echoing off the walls, creating a hellish choir of impending doom. Ping, 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 ping. "Countermeasures are ineffective in here, Captain," Vargas reported, despair creeping in. "The walls are scattering them." Crow's mind was a cold, dark machine. Options, there were none. Fight. Firing a torpedo in this confined space was suicide. The backblast and concussion would crumple them like a beer can. Surface. They'd be a sitting duck for the Alpha and the Yankee. He had led his men into a tomb of his own choosing. Then, a new sound. A deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the entire boat, followed by a shuddering, metallic groan that went on for seconds. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of something enormous colliding with the canyon wall. "Gone. Sonar." The first torpedo. It hit the western wall. Detonation. Minimal. Influence fuse, maybe. Kohler's report was frantic. The second torpedo is still on us, bearing constant. The explosion of the first weapon was a gift and a curse. The concussion wave slammed into the Borealis, rolling her violently to starboard. Men were thrown from their stations. An electrical panel shorted in a shower of sparks, filling the air with the smell of burnt insulation. But the explosion also filled the canyon with a massive roiling cloud of sediment and debris, an acoustic nightmare. All stop. Rig for ultra quiet. Now, shut everything down. Crow commanded. It was the last desperate move of a hunted animal, play dead. The turbines whined into silence. The pumps ceased. Even the faint hum of the lights died, plunging them into the deep red glow of the emergency batteries. The only sounds were the agonized groans of the stressed hull, the ragged breathing of 40 terrified men, and the relentless, searching ping, ping, ping of the remaining torpedo, now muffled and distorted by the suspended silt. In the torpedo room, the darkness was near total, broken only by handheld battle lanterns. The hydraulic leak was clamped. The seawater inflow was slowed to a manageable icy trickle by a frantic patch job. But the compartment was a freezing, oil-slicked hell. Chief Rollins leaned against a tube, breathing in ragged gasps, his hands raw and bleeding. Seaman Riley sat slumped against a bulkhead, shivering uncontrollably, not from cold alone, but from the sheer, soul-consuming terror. He stared at the patched crack, waiting for it to fail. Every ping from the hunting torpedo outside made him flinch. He was waiting for the moment the steel would finally give way, and the black, freezing void would claim him. He thought of the sun. He couldn't remember what it felt like. Back in control, Crow stood motionless in the red gloom. The plot was dead. They were blind. He was commanding by instinct and sound alone. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, the weight of their trust, their fear, their unspoken accusation. He had gambled with their lives and lost. The torpedo's pings were getting clearer. It was filtering through the mud, learning the new soundscape, finding its way. McAllister appeared beside him, his face etched with soot and exhaustion. Forward compartment is secure, but it's a mess, Captain. We've lost secondary hydraulics. The men are at their breaking point. He paused, his voice dropping. Riley's catatonic. Rollins is keeping him together, but just barely. Crow just nodded. The human factor. The weakest link wasn't metal. It was the mind. A scream, a panicked move, a single dropped tool that echoed through the hull. Any of it could give them away. Then, a new development. Faint at first, then growing clearer. Thrum, 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 thrum. The Yankee. Its distinctive modulated heartbeat. It was back. And it was closer. Much closer. It was hovering at the top of the canyon, like a vulture waiting for the last twitch of life to cease below. He's listening, Kohler whispered, the sound carrying in the tomb-like silence. He's got his tail over the canyon mouth. We're trapped. The Alpha is holding back. Sir, they're herding us. The torpedo is the sheepdog. The realization was a final crushing weight. This wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration, a show of utter dominance. The Soviets had them cornered, wounded, and were now calmly observing their death throes. The torpedo's pings were a countdown. The Yankees' thrumming was a funeral dirge. Crow looked at the red-painted firing button cover. One flick of the wrist. Unleash their own weapons. Go down fighting. Take the Alpha with them. Maybe even scar the Yankee. It was what the manual said. It was what Washington would expect. A final, defiant act. He saw the faces of his crew in the bloody light. Young men. Vargas, who wanted to be an engineer. Kohler, who read poetry. McAllister, who had a granddaughter he'd never met. They were watching him. Not a captain, but a man. A man who held the last match. The torpedo pinged again. Louder, sharper. It had resolved the confusion. It had a lock. The sound was right outside the hull. In that infinite second, Elias Crow made his choice. Not as a warrior, but as a man who refused to light the pyre. "All hands," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. A flat stone dropped into a still pool. "This is the captain. Brace for impact." The word impact hung in the stale, red-tinged air, not as a command, but as a final verdict. It was a surrender to physics, to fate, to the cold calculus of the deep. In that suspended moment, the Borealis ceased to be a warship. It became a coffin, and every man inside it felt the lid slam shut in his soul. Seaman Riley, in the freezing, oil-slick torpedo room, heard the captain's calm, dead voice through the grating of the 1MC. "Brace for impact." The words cut through his catatonia with the clarity of a shard of ice. He wasn't thinking of San Diego or the sun anymore. He thought of his mother's hands, the specific, mundane way she'd peel potatoes at the kitchen sink, the sunlight catching the dust motes in the air. A profound, aching homesickness washed over him, so violent it was a physical pain. He curled tighter against the cold steel, pressing his forehead to it, as if he could push through to the other side. Chief Rollins placed a heavy, bleeding hand on his shoulder, a wordless anchor. They waited. In the control room, Captain Crow did not brace. He stood straight, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes fixed on the sonar speaker, as if he could see death approaching through the sound. Lieutenant Kohler had removed his headset. The amplified ping was now a naked, shrieking beacon in the silent room. It was a drill into the skull. Ping, ping, ping. Each one closer, sharper, more personal. The sound Dopplered, rising in pitch. The torpedo was accelerating for its final sprint. The weapons officer, Vargas, had his hand physically on the firing button cover, his eyes locked on Crow, begging for a counter-order, for permission to spit defiance into the dark. Crow gave a minute, almost imperceptible shake of his head. No, the war would not start here, not by his hand. The crushing weight of that decision, to die passively, to accept annihilation without retaliation, etched itself into the lines of his face. He saw his own reflection, distorted and ghostly, in the dark glass of a dead radar screen. He looked like a stranger. The pinging reached a fever pitch, a single continuous tone of targeting certainty. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound. It was the silence of the trigger being pulled, of the guillotine blade falling. 40 men inhaled as one and held it. 1 second. 2. The groans of the hull were deafening in the void. A sound then, but not the apocalyptic detonation they were braced for. It was a dull, wet thump, followed by a rapid, metallic screech that trailed away into the distance, fading fast. It was the sound of something heavy, dense, and mechanical, scraping along the canyon wall hundreds of feet above them, then falling away into the abyss. For 5 full seconds, no one understood. "Gone? Sonar." Kohler's voice was a croak of disbelief. He fumbled his headset back on. "The torpedo. It lost lock. It veered starboard, sir. It hit the canyon wall. A glancing blow. It's still active, but its seeker head is damaged. It's spinning off, diving, going deep. It's gone. The release of tension was a physical force. A sailor vomited quietly onto the deck. Another let out a sob. He instantly strangled. They weren't dead. Not yet. But why? The question was electric. In the sediment cloud, with her boat silent, the torpedo's own sonar must have been reflected. Confused. It had locked onto the louder, clearer return of the solid rock wall instead of their muted, dying signature. A 1 in a million echo. A gift from the chaotic gods of the deep. Then, the other sound returned. Thrum, 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 thrum. The Yankee. It was still there. A long pause. And then, a new signal. Not the aggressive modulation from before. This was simpler. Slower. 3 long pulses. A gap, then 2 short. A universally recognized signal, even in this silent war. The ship's sonar, querying, "Are you there?" It wasn't a taunt. It carried a strange, chilling formality. An inventory. Confirmation of a job done. Crow found his voice, though it felt like someone else's. No response. Absolute silence. Helm, ahead, dead slow. 1 knot. Take us out of the canyon, south along the trench line. Use the terrain. Don't make a sound she can't blame on whales. The Borealis, wounded and bleeding sound, began to creep like a crippled animal from a trap. For hours, they slunk through the underwater ravines, every groan of their damaged hull sounding like a scream in the stillness. The Yankee did not follow. The Alpha's signature had vanished entirely. The hunt was over. They had been assessed, cornered, broken, and then released. The message was clearer than any torpedo hit. We saw you. We could have killed you. Remember that. 48 hours later, the Barents Sea, transit depth. The atmosphere aboard the Borealis was not one of relief, but of profound, sickened shock. They were alive, but they felt corpse-like. The damage was contained, the cracked hull patch holding, the hydraulic systems jury-rigged. The physical wounds would heal, the others festered. Seaman Riley stood his watch in the torpedo room, his eyes forever darting to the patched hull. He functioned, but the light behind his eyes was dimmed. He no longer spoke of the future. Chief Rollins watched him like a hawk, but the camaraderie was now tinged with the pity of the survivor for the spiritually wounded. In the control room, the mood was funereal. The mission was an abject secret failure. They would file a sanitized report. Evaded hostile contact after technical malfunction. No engagement. The truth, their utter tactical dismantling, their captain's refusal to fire, would be buried deeper than any submarine, known only to the 40 souls aboard. Captain Crow stood on the con, staring into the perpetual night of the deep. The faces of his crew, their terrified eyes in the red light, were burned onto his retinas. He had looked into the abyss of total war and had blinked. Was it wisdom or cowardice? He had preserved a fragile, shameful peace by accepting humiliation. He had saved his men to return them to a world that would never understand the cost. He thought of the Yankee captain, a phantom in another steel tube. Did he feel the same weight? Were they just 2 ghosts, passing in the night, each carrying the keys to the apocalypse for a nation that saw them only as abstract instruments? The victory belonged to the man who had better controlled his fear. Crow was no longer sure which of them that was. Lieutenant Kohler approached, holding a headset. "Picking up distant traffic, Captain. Commercial shipping lanes. We're back in the world." Crow didn't turn. The world never left, James. We just got a glimpse of the basement it's built on. He finally looked at the young officer, seeing the same haunted knowledge in his eyes. Log the contact as miscellaneous. Continue course for home. Home, Kohler repeated, the word tasting hollow. As the Borealis began her long, slow ascent from the hunting grounds, a final ghostly signal whispered through the water. Faint, on the edge of detection. Thrum, 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 then nothing. A farewell or a reminder. Crow walked through his boat, the conqueror of a kingdom of shadows. The dripping pipe in the mess had finally been fixed. The silence it left was somehow worse. It was the silence of a debt unpaid, a score unsettled. He reached his tiny cabin, the size of a coffin. On the small desk was a photo of his wife, smiling in the sun, a sun that felt like a myth from another universe. He sat on his bunk, the exhaustion a geological layer settling on him. He had not pressed the button. The world had not ended in fire today, but something in him had. The unshakable faith in the mission, in the clean lines of the Cold War, had been corroded away by the cold, salt water of futility. They were returning to port. There would be debriefs in windowless rooms, handshakes from admirals who wouldn't meet his eye, and then another patrol, another ghost to chase in the dark. The war hadn't ended. It had just coiled back into the depths, patient and eternal. And he, Elias Crow, would go back into the dark, carrying the heavy, frozen knowledge that the real enemy wasn't the phantom in the other boat. It was the silence, the pressure, and the terrible, simple choice waiting for him in the red-lit gloom next time. Outside the hull, in the infinite, indifferent black, the deep breathed on, waiting for the next hunt to begin.